I'm in my 70s and I live in Oxford. I live with my husband, who is from an ethnic minority background. He comes originally from Bengal in India, and he grew up in a very rural part of India. He is nearly 80, and we've been married for 50 years. We met in London when we were both students, and he was studying art and I was a nursing student. We met in 1960s and we married very quickly because he knew that his parents, particularly his mother, would not agree to the marriage. Life in Britain in the 60s was a changing period because suddenly there were people who were teenage, and there was a lot of music and a lot of change in the society. So I felt that the people around us would be more open to our relationship, but in fact there was a very traditional, basic antipathy to people who, especially of mixed race, who married English girls. I think the reason was because British society was very traditional and very white at the time. There were not very many people of ethnic minorities, although in London probably more so. I lived in West London where there were many people of West Indian origin, but otherwise outside the big towns it was very traditional society. I think people married very much from their own communities on the whole. My family was already a very mixed family. I had 2 adopted brothers, both of whom were mixed race. So my parents were Quakers and they had adopted children. So my parents had absolutely no problem. The only thing my father said was that when I had children, I knew what the issues might be for them. My close friends were people from abroad, tended to be from other countries. I was nursing in London and I had friends who were Malaysian. They'd come to do training here. So I didn't actually find a problem at all. I mean, my society within my own friendship groups was always people from other parts of the world. The most difficulty I found was with my husband's parents, who were living in India and who were very against the fact that their eldest son was marrying out of Bengal and out of the Hindu tradition. I was introduced to his parents in India. I met his mother on the ship that we had arrived on in Bombay. I spoke a little Bengali, which was his first language, and I could just about say, hello and how are you, and tried to behave in a way which would be acceptable. But it was very difficult. That was the most difficult part, really, of the whole situation. Once the marriage had taken place, the parents' reactions were acceptance, and they knew that was the situation and they accepted it. Luckily, otherwise we would have been somewhere out on our ear probably. I felt very alone in India because my husband was particularly keen on appeasing his family, and he'd been away from them for 7 years before he married, and so he was very much concerned that I should fit in with that. I mean, at that point, had we stayed, I might have become disillusioned with the whole thing and returned, but as it happened, things turned out differently. After we were married and after we'd lived in India for a year and our son was born there, they did everything they could to make me feel at home. So the reaction of some family members was very negative, but some were very positive and tried their best to integrate me within the family. In fact, the grandfather was the one who was most against everything because he was very traditional. But my mother-in-law said, well, this is how it is and there's not much we can do about it. When we arrived, I was already pregnant, and so I didn't work. I stayed at home and tried to learn the language and learn the customs of the place I was living in. I learnt how to sing a little bit in Bengali, which was a tradition. and met family members. We did quite a lot of travelling around and meeting people. I tried to be as Bengali a wife as I could from my perspective. I wore saris, I used the jewellery and all those kind of things that to represent that to a wider society, if you like. And people found that rather, I suppose, endearing in some way because I was trying hard. My image of how my life would be there probably was related to Gandhi because I'd been brought up within the Quaker tradition, and so I knew a lot about Gandhi and about how he was there. I suppose I thought it would be much more like living with him and doing good in India. I was a nurse after all, so I had ideas about working there. But once I had a baby, then it was a bit different. Many a time I thought, I wish I wasn't here, but it was mostly after the birth of my first child. The relationship with my husband was very new. We'd only known each other for half a year, really, before we married. So not only were we coping with that, but with the birth of a child, the change in our way of life. He decided that he would return to Britain, which he did, and to take up some further study. And I remained in India with his parents. When my husband was away, I found it easier to be in India because I became able really to decide for myself how I would conduct my life rather than feeling that I had to be this wife that I wasn't really that sort of a person, I suppose. I was an independent woman who had worked for the previous years before I married. He expected me to become who I am, but he found that easier in Britain, whereas in India he felt he had to conform to the parental wishes to an extent, especially as he's married out of his culture. And then after 3 months he had money which he could use to pay my fare to return to England. I was happy in the sense that I was able to be with my husband, but also that I could see my family, which was important because they hadn't seen my baby either. The support from my family was not what I had expected or hoped for because my parents still had 3 children at home themselves, and they expected me to be the independent person that I'd always been. And of course at that time I needed probably more support than they could give, particularly my mother, who was very, very busy with my grandmother as well, who lived at home. We were living in poverty, really, because he was a student and I had to manage the baby, and we lived in a very small flat. Well, 2 rooms really, but I remember the mice jumping out of the bins, and we just had to manage on very little. My own role, I think I could say, was difficult whilst I was at home. It was only when I began to study again and then to have an independent working life later that I felt I'd returned to myself, if you like. I achieved it, yes, through study and through having a home of our own eventually. We had 2 children, a boy and a girl. We lived with our children mainly in Britain, but we had a lot of periods when we travelled to India and lived in India for some time. The attraction between us is as human beings on the level of interests and shared lives, and that still exists today after 50 years. The recipe to maintain relationship in the face of difficulties outside is to talk to each other about it and to live your life as well as you can, really. We're still together, but throughout our marriage we've had fairly independent lives. We're together but apart, if you like. I mean, that's how I see it. And he has interests different to mine, very different. I've always had interests different to his, but we have family in common and we have a life together. The difference is what makes people behave in the way they do, because they don't understand that change and difference are what makes the world a better place in a way.